This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange with me, Sarah Raven. And actually today I'm not joined by a guest, I'm on my own because I wanted to talk to you about a family of plants that I get more and more obsessed with every year. And you may say I've banged on about this before. I think I have a few years ago, but not so recently. But to be honest, I've been so blown away by them this spring that I really wanted to highlight them again. And I just thought I would chat through why I love Narcissus, the good old daffodil, and then highlight 10 new varieties that we've trialled this year and last and that have really just totally excelled. And then finally, I'm going to take you through how we've grown them. We planted them last autumn and how we've grown them and how they've been so unbelievably stellar this spring. So why Narcissus? Well, so I guess I'm not really talking about the sort of stonking yellow ones that you see that start flowering in London in January and certainly by February, which have those rather chunky, almost iris-like leaves. They definitely have their place, and I really love a bunch of daffs on the table as winter turns. Christmas is over. It's really nice to have some cheery colours. So there's a place for every daff, in my view. But these aren't they. These are much, much more kind of ethereal, classy, architectural, sculptural varieties. And there are just so many reasons why I'm mad on them. And I guess the first and most important, in a way, is to do with climate change. And I don't know if you've noticed, we have certainly noticed, and I think most of us have as gardeners, that things are getting wetter, aren't they? And last spring 24, was super wet. It really was. It was just the rainfall. I mean, I'm afraid I haven't got the stats here, but I think it was kind of had the highest rainfall in March and April that records have practically ever had. And then May was also quite dull. But anyway, the problem with that, if you grow tulips, is that you can get tulip blight because it's a fungal disease, and low light levels and high humidity cause the proliferation of any fungal disease. Now, that does affect tulips, the queens of the spring garden, but it does not affect, and there doesn't seem to be anything, as far as we can tell from our trials at Perch Hill, that affect Narcissus. So it is just there. It's such a disease-resistant family. It just doesn't seem to have any of the problems. And if you see where they grow incredibly well, it's often in really relatively moistish, not wet, but in moistish climates they thrive. I mean, in Scotland, you'll see them absolutely thriving. And I'll come back to Scotland in a minute. But so whatever the rainfall, I think Narcissus are going to remain unaffected. And wow, that's a boon, because if you're planting an expensive bulb and we don't know what climate change is going to pour onto us in the next few years, then it's really nice to know something's going to thrive in quite challenging conditions. So for me, that has made me take them even more seriously than I was already and want to trial more and more new varieties. And when we go off to Holland to look primarily at tulips, now, whereas we might visit 8 tulip breeders, we would certainly visit 3 Narcissus breeders too at the same time, because they've become unbelievably important to us in the garden here. The second thing is fragrance. Well, it's true that tulips, like ballerina, are very perfumed and are really wonderful. But of course, Narcissus are famous for having fantastic perfume. It's a real divider, this, because there is a gene, apparently, which dictates how you perceive narcissus scent. And Josie Lewis, I mean, I have mentioned this before, but our head gardener really can't stand paper whites. It's almost like they're sort of off, or she goes into the greenhouse and you can see her sort of knock back and she's not making it up. And it's not, you can see it's not her thinking, I don't like this perfume. It's literally, it's much more, it's stronger than that. She really doesn't like it. Now, that is true of paper whites, but if you move into any of the Tozetta group or things that are crossed with the Tozetta group, you get a much cleaner, what I would say more stephanotis-y, slightly jasmine-y scent, but not so it's sort of massive umami somehow, which is what I think that the paper white has in it. So fragrance is unbelievably important, and there are many varieties, and I'm going to talk about fragrance when I actually highlight my favourites in the next section. And the third thing, which I have undoubtedly talked about in the past, is perenniality. And I think I have told this story once or twice on the podcast before, but it's not really a story, it's just a record, which is that we spend really quite a bit of time, and I was partly brought up on the west coast of Scotland. And there we have a little cottage next to an old walled garden where the house fell down towards the end of the 19th century. It was burnt down, actually, and then taken down. But the walled garden obviously predated that because it was there to grow the produce, the flowers and the vegetables for the big house at the top of the hill. And the reason it's there, and probably why the house is there, is because of the Gulf Stream. And it is really noticeable. When I was there this winter, at the head of the loch, this is on the west coast opposite Mull, it was in deep frost down to -3, whereas in our cottage, it was at +1. And whether that's the bulk of the sea or the Gulf Stream, but anyway, being right down on the Sound of Mull really makes a massive difference. And I imagine that's why the walled garden's there. But that's by the by. The thing that is wonderful is that the whole of the edge of the walled garden and around our cottage is in May surrounded by Narcissus poeticus alba planus. And that's the double pheasant's eye. Very, very deliciously perfumed, really wonderful. And it has been there since the middle of the 19th century. So isn't that amazing? These bulbs have been living in a very wet climate for nearly 200 years, gradually spreading, quietly thriving over that time. And I absolutely love that. So, there aren't many plants. Rhubarb is also there, and that has also thrived. But those are the only two things left. And that is pretty impressive. So absolute lack of disease, incredible fragrance, perenniality. And then the final thing that I think is remarkable about them is with some varieties, you will also find a very, very long, light flowering pattern. And Adam and I spent the winter of 2018, 2019 in the mountains in the middle of Crete, in a valley just below Silariti, which is the highest mountain in the centre of Crete. And we were going for a good long time. We went for 2.5 months. And so we couldn't possibly leave our dogs behind because we would have missed them too much. So we drove out there and we took our dogs with us. But of course, it meant that we went for a walk every day. And there's something really fantastic about that, about getting to know a place really, really well. And there are certain wonderful stone paths that crisscross the Amari Valley where we were. And on one route, which we would take maybe 2 or 3 times a week, on the corner underneath a stone wall, so very well drained, was a big clump of Narcissus tozetta, the wild narcissus. And it was in flower on our first walk in mid-December because I picked a flower and brought it back and put it on my desk. And it was still the same clump was in flower when we left, which was the last week of February. And that to me was absolutely incredible. So it was in flower for a good 10 weeks, I'd say. And that, again, the genetics as well as the perfume, but that long light cropping pattern has been bred into a few of the UK bred Scilly Isle and Cornish Narcissus. And there are a couple of varieties that we've trialled that have been around for longer. One is Avalanche, and that seems to have that same characteristic of a long light cropping pattern. The other is Cragford, which is the most delicious, again, both fragrant and both a long light cropping pattern. And then there are a couple of new ones. One is Polar Hunter and another is Starlight Sensation. I'm going to come on to each of those individually, but both have scent and both have this long light cropping pattern. So they must have some Tozetta genetics spread into them because you get that as a real, it's just an emblem of power, I would say, to have all those things going for them. And I couldn't more passionately recommend each of those varieties. So the next bit that I just want to talk about is down to varieties. And Starlight Sensation, which I just mentioned, has just blown us away the last 2-3 years since we've been trialing it. And again, because they're perennial, we put these in, I think, in 2021. And they're still looking fantastic in spring 25. Of course they are, because they're so perennial. But this is an ivory variety. And the new Sensation series has come out. And there's one called Moonlight Sensation, which is equally fantastic in a pale yellow. But Starlight Sensation is more ivory. It's great value for money because they flower prolifically for 5 or 6 weeks with us in our trial. They're multi-headed, which means that they give you real impact. And I think they're fantastic for picking, but they're also fantastic for pots. And March and April pots, we've got them in the Dutch yard, and wow, they've just been amazing. Unbelievably highly recommended also is Polar Hunter. So this is my favourite of the very early ones. So this flowers from February in a normal year. It really does, which is incredibly valuable. Multi-headed, very fragrant, also cuts exceptionally well, lasting a week in water. I couldn't believe that. I had a pot of this on a window ledge in my little London house, and I picked 1 or 2 to put on my desk to cheer me up as I was writing, and they just went on flowering and flowering in water and flowering even longer out in the cool on the window ledge. So Polar Hunter is another absolute stonker, I'd say. Cordobensis is a third new one to us, and this looks quite like, you may have heard me talk about Cocopelli, which is a real favourite of Josie. Very delicate, real sunshine yellow, but really delicate flower form, similar to Baby Moon too, which has tiny flowers. But for me, Cordobensis wins over all three because it's so elegant and delicate. With lovely small flowers on long, thin stems. It looks almost like a butterfly, I think. And massive, powerful fragrance in that kind of lovely, lush, egg yolk, golden yellow. Wonderful in pots, wonderful in grass, wonderful naturalizer, and wonderful cut flower. So that would be the next one for me. I've got to bring in Josie again here because she's crazy about white petticoat. So that's our head gardener at Perch Hill. This is really known for its perenniality. So we've had it in the same bulb pan now for 5 or 6 years. It flowers for 5 or 6 weeks from February. It's part of the hoop petticoat group. So do you know what I mean by those? They look like ballerinas on the stage in Swan Lake or something. So they look like they're dancing in a hoop petticoat. Not scented and single-headed, but just standout delicacy and beauty. And yeah, it's a stunner. And as I say, completely perennial in a pot. Just let it dry out and go into proper dormancy in the late summer into the late autumn. And then give it a little bit of water, just one watering in autumn, and it'll come back into growth again. A couple of, or 3 actually, very little, sort of again, very delicate ones for little pot trays and bulb trays. Pipit is the biggest of these 3 in a lovely soft primrose yellow. And the thing that's remarkable about Pipit is it changes to cream as the flowers develop. So you get sort of primrose yellow and cream in the same bulb pan. And it's a pretty mix of colours and it has great scent. It's very unusual. It's kind of perhaps quite a Marmite thing. Quite a lot of people don't like yellow. But I love it with the mix of cream. And then 2 I'll talk about together are snipe and minnow. So one is named after a bird and one's named after a fish, but they're both super delicate. So snipe It reminds me of an Iznik painting. It's kind of like a kind of cave painting or a fabric painting with their really beautiful trumpet, and then the petals reflex right back on the stem and they sort of flare right out. Absolutely lovely kind of linear delicacy. And not scented, but just utterly beautiful. Minnow is scented, really strong fragrance, but tiny. So, the flowers are kind of like not quite a 5p piece, but not much bigger. They kind of look like a daisy, if you can imagine that as a narcissus. And then 3 final ones. Bell's Song, which has been around for slightly longer. Really unusual in its colouring. It's got very, very beautiful, soft pink grapefruit coloured petals with a ivory trumpet. And I love the combination of that. And it has very, very gentle, lovely scent. So that's another one. Polar Ice, I absolutely love, which is one of the pheasant's eye types, but in, as you can imagine, if it's called Polar Ice, in a kind of ivory, polar bear and white in that kind of colour range. Really good and late. So if you want a late narcissus, and having a succession is a wonderful thing. So Polar Ice is really good for late. And then finally, I couldn't do a piece on narcissus without mentioning Actaea, which is a classic pheasant's eye. Flowers in March into April. I planted 20 bulbs, perhaps 15, 20 years ago now. It's now about 2,000. So it's the most brilliant naturalizer, absolute bargain drift maker through grass. We've got it on an east-facing bank at Perch Hill. Just to hide the polytunnels, we created this bank and planted it up with hazel, and I underplanted it with 20 bulbs, maybe 25 of Narcissus Actaea. It means I can pick armfuls of these beautiful, fragrant, wonderful, wonderful flowers as soon as spring begins. So those are my top picks, and all those will be in the podcast notes. So look for them there. And I just wanted to finish with how we've planted these. So all new trial varieties, and then adding in some absolute classic bests and sort of old favourites. So they go in trenches that are dug to about 30 centimetres, 12 inches on a bed of grit. The bottom layer is the narcissus, spread at twice the width that you would in a pot, so 4 times the width of the bulb about. So they're about 15 centimetres apart, the bulbs, because I don't want to have to lift and divide this bed, because it will be there for 100 years, hopefully. So they go in first as the bottom layer. So this is in the autumn. Then Dutch iris go in around, over the top of them, and around the edge, hyacinths and alliums, allium purple sensation, and the hyacinth called Anastasia, which is the most fragrant and delicate. They will give us things to pick with early narcissus, like I said, Polar Hunter from February, right the way through a succession of varieties, taking us through to Polar Ice in April into May. Then the Dutch iris will come into flower. And then finally, added as a top layer at this time of year, go in dahlias. So planting as the narcissus foliage dies back, we slot in dahlias over their heads, which are planted in pots and grown on to a good 6 inches so the slugs don't get them. And they go in May. And they will then flower from the middle of June with the early single varieties until hopefully early December, certainly late November. So then we have a gap in December, but then we start picking narcissus again in February. And with those, there's something to pick almost every month of the year, and they're done in a classic bulb lasagne. So narcissus on the bottom with hyacinths and alliums around the edge. So their foliage flops over the path mainly rather than over the dahlias as they come up. Dutch iris in the next layer, and in the top layer, the dahlias. So explained quite quickly, but there's lots more. I've done a whole podcast on that. So we can put the cross-references to that podcast episode if you wanted to know more. So that's it. I couldn't live without the Narcissus family. They are my absolute mainstay for the early spring. Thanks so much for listening to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, on Narcissus. I hope you enjoyed that. Next week, I'm joined by an incredible honeybee and general bee expert, Richard Rickett, who's someone who came up to us actually at the Chelsea Flower Show in May last year, and we started chatting about gardening for bees. He is just such an expert, not just on honeybees, but also bumblebees and all our wild bees, so solitary bees too, what to grow for them and how to sort of deepen our knowledge and passion and love for them. And it certainly really inspired me and the gardeners at Perch Hill to start keeping records of the bees that we have. See them. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.